So our next topic is rearranging formulas. This formula here converts Fahrenheit into Celsius. So if I want to convert Celsius to Fahrenheit, I'm going to need to rearrange this formula and isolate for F. One way to do this is to use inverse operations. And inverse operations undo or reverse each other. So for example, what I do is I look at the formula and say, what is happening to F? Well, the first thing is that we're subtracting 32 if we follow order of operations. We start with the brackets. Then we multiply by 5. And then finally, you divide by 9. And when you do those three operations, you end up getting Celsius. So if I want to rearrange or isolate the formula for F, I just need to reverse all these operations. So dividing by 9, the opposite operation is multiply. Timesing by 5, the opposite operation is dividing by 5. And subtracting 32, the opposite operation is adding 32. So what this is now saying, it's saying if I take the C value and I multiply it by 9, I divide it by 5, and I add 32, that is now going to equal a formula for Fahrenheit. So this formula converts Celsius to Fahrenheit. We sub in the Celsius, and out we get Fahrenheit. So this is one method of isolating for equation. Another method, which you're more familiar with, or may be more familiar with, is to take our original equation and isolate for F. So the first thing I see is I'm going to times both sides by 9. So the 9's cancel. And I get 9C is equal to 5 F minus 32. Then the next step, I need to divide both sides by the 5. So I get 9C over 5 is equal to F minus 32. And then the last step is to add 32 to both sides. And this gives me that 9C over 5 plus 32 equals F, which is the same formula I have using the other method. So again, it's your choice which method you'd like to use. So let's do a couple examples. So the volume of a rectangular prism is given by V equals length times width times height. So I want to isolate for H. So let's look at what happens to H. So H, to get to V, I need to multiply by both length and width. So the opposite operation is to divide by length and width. So what this tells me is that if I take my volume and divide it by length and width, I get H. So again, notice I started with the variable I want to isolate for, and then connected it to the variable that was initially isolated for. So let's go and do this one more time. So L is the variable I want to isolate for, and if I look at the equation, L is being multiplied by the width and the height, and when you multiply by the width and the height, that gives you the volume, length times width times height. And to undo that operation, I'm going to divide by the width and the height. So I'm going to take V and divide it by the width and the height. So I get V divided by width and height is equal to the length. And again, if you have another method you prefer, please use that. So let's try a few more examples. So the amount A of a 2-year investment is given by the formula A equals P 1 plus I all squared, where P is the principal invested, the amount of money you put into the account, and I is the interest rate. So we want to isolate for I, then determine the interest rate for a $5,000 investment that ends up equaling $5,512.50 after 2 years. So again, we want to isolate for I. So let's look at what happens to interest rate. So looking at this equation here, P times 1 plus I all squared. Using order of operations, if we look at the variable I need to add 1 to it. I then need to square it. So I'll put a little square symbol there. And then once you square it, I need to multiply by the variable P, or the principal. And that gives me the amount of the investment. So let's work backwards. So I need to divide by the principal. The opposite of a square is square root, whatever you have. And then the inverse of plus 1 is minus 1. So this is saying I have A. I'm going to divide it by the principal, P. I'm going to square root that whole thing, and then I'm going to minus 1. And that should give me my interest rate I. Looking above, we see that the principal invested is $5,000. The amount we got at the end of the 2 years is $5,512.50. So we have that A, again that's the total amount, is $5,512.50. We have the principal P, which is 5,000, and those are the only two variables we need to sub into this formula. So our interest rate is the square root of $5,512.50 over $5,000, all square rooted, minus 1. And what I end up with is an interest rate of 0.05, which is 5% per year. Now if you're not sure how to type that into your calculator, so using your calculator, you'd hit your square root button. You may need to add a bracket. Then you would type in $5,512.50 divided by 5,000. Close that bracket, so that'll be everything square rooted, and then minus 1. Make sure the minus 1 is outside of the square root. And you should get 0.05. All right, last one. I want to isolate this one for x, and this is a tricky one because x is in the denominator this time. So we're going to use a similar idea we did with trig ratios. If the variable is in the denominator, we're going to flip both sides. Now remember, this is y over 1, so I'm going to flip both sides of this equation, and I get 1 over y is equal to x minus 1 over 12. So remember, we're isolating for x. So let's discuss what's happening to x. So if we look at it closely, x, the first thing you're going to do is minus 1 from x. Then once we minus 1, we divide by 12. Order of operations. Start with the numerator of the fraction, then divide by the denominator. And that gives us, this time, 1 over y, if we look at the left side of this equation. So let's undo these operations. So divide by 12 is to multiply by 12, to minus 1 is to add 1. So this is saying we're going to take 1 over y, we're going to multiply by 12, and we're going to add 1. And what that will equal is our x. So again, we started here, we multiplied by 12, added 1, and that equals our x. We could simplify this just a bit. Remember, this is 12 over 1, so we multiply numerator by numerator, denominator by denominator, and we get that x is equal to 12 over y plus 1, which is the equation that we need. And notice for homework this time, it's 2 to 16, but just do every even question, please.